Hi, I'm going to talk to you today about reinventing the mind. So that seems like an audacious topic to take, but it's something which I've been studying for a while. So I'm a technologist. Seems a little strange that I'm talking to you about reinventing the mind, but my background is in artificial intelligence research, and I've been in technology for the last 20 years. And one thing I've realized as I work with creating engaging experiences is we're altering our minds. So what do I mean by reinventing the mind? So this idea that we can change our mind actually comes from this idea that our brains are plastic. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. Before I do, let me tell you a story from Greek mythology. Procrustes. He had an inn on the side of the road to Athens. He used to invite people in and for a nice meal, and he said he had a magical bed, which was really comfortable. It would fit any person perfectly. In reality, his bed was actually a normal bed, and the way he fitted people to it was with chopping off a couple of limbs or stretching them. The reason I tell you this story is because I think for the last 30 years, and definitely for most of my career, we've been designing technology which we as people have to fit to. It's hard to think about things, room-sized computers, and we look at things like our mobile phones, our iPads, and we think that technology now fits us better. But we weren't designed, our brains weren't designed or evolved to work with some of these technologies which we have now taken for granted. So my research is in motivational design. So for the last few years, I've been looking at how our brains actually work, how they don't work, and understanding our motivational systems. So last year, I talked a lot about this idea of motivational design. Some of you might have heard about gamification, this idea of taking game design principles and creating engaging user experiences. Motivational design goes a little bit further than that. It actually talks to you about how the motivational system in our brain works and how to create engagement with it. One of the things I started realizing as we design technology based on our motivational system, it puts the user back in the center. So this isn't persuasive design or seductive design. This isn't about trying to get you to do something. Our whole process and methodology is to understand what the user, you, want to do and creating technology which fits. So turning the tables on Procrustes, we want to start designing technology which fits us. And to do that, we did a lot of research into how the brain actually works, how it's evolved. And as we started doing more of these kinds of engaging experiences, one thing I started realizing was we're changing our minds. So this idea of reinventing our minds. So some of you might be familiar with the McLean triune model of the brain. So this idea that it's a very crude model, but it kind of talks about how our brains have evolved for the last 300 million years. Reptilian brains, 200 million years ago, we kind of have our mammalian brains, and right up to a couple of million years ago, we've got our, what we have as hominid brains. The interesting thing is we look at this very crude model of how we upgraded our brains is the fact that we have actually started evolving a little further than that. So not only do we have to consider the brain, which is the hardware. I'm a technologist, so I think about these things in hardware and software. The mind is the software which runs on the brain. And as I started looking at trying to understand the mental software of our brains, I realized we've gone through 3 major upgrades of our brain. Mind 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. And this sounds funny. It's actually, as we think about it, we start understanding that how we upgraded our mental operating system is actually more similar to how Microsoft upgrades operating systems. This old software and this new software have to live together continuously. The software which evolved 200 million years ago is now playing together with software of our minds, which is 50,000 years ago. And even 50,000 years ago is pretty old. The savannas of Africa, where our brains were molded as hominids, is very different to the glass, brick, metal, crowded environments we live in today. So as I thought about how we start designing technology which can fit our minds better, I realized that what we were actually doing is creating Mind 4.0. This idea that software and technology could actually start playing the role of the next evolution of our mind. So, we could wait millions of years for our brains to evolve, or we can actually start creating technology and software which can help us. This sounds strange, right? This idea that we can, through technology, change our brains. But the understanding of how it works, we start realizing that the emotional brain, the rational brain, all the conflicts between these different software systems in our brain working together cause a lot of issues. We've heard of cognitive biases, the irrationality which we have, and the designing software which actually takes those into account is something which we started realizing was we were kind of creating this interface which allowed us to interact with the world and each other more seamlessly. So you have to understand two interesting concepts about our brain. One is this idea that the DNA, our DNA, molds not only our bodies, our brains, but also our behaviors. So Richard Dawkins talks about the extended phenotype. He talks about the fact the DNA of a spider not only codes for the body of the spider, but also the spider's web. This idea that he creates the web is actually encoded in the DNA. When we look at human behavior, it gets a little bit more complex. Not only are we basically evolved to have certain behaviors, when you put 7 billion of us on a planet interacting through technology, we start having some really interesting behavioral interactions. So that's the one aspect of our brains. We create these mental webs around ourselves, which are how we interact with people, how we interact with technology, and the things around us. And this brings us to the other part of the extended brain. So not only is this idea that our DNA codes for our behavior, there's this idea of brain extension. Andy Clark talks about natural-born cyborgs. Sounds scary, right? But what he's really talking about is the fact that we use technology to expand our minds. We use things like Post-it notes to be memory reminders. We use books, computers. We basically go outside our physical brains and actually use these tools to augment it. He actually starts talking a little bit about certain aspects of our brain, which is fairly unique. So there's this really interesting experiment where you sit down on the table, you put your arm on top of it, and you get, actually your arm below it, and you get a volunteer to come and basically tap your arm. At the same time, with the other hand, they're tapping the table. You can only visually see the table. You can't see your arm underneath it. The interesting sensation is it feels like the table is an extension of your body. You actually start feeling the tapping of the table as what is translated to your body. Your body's concept of itself is expanded. There's a second part of the experiment where you get somebody with a hammer and they actually hammer the table. And the response of the participants is the same as if somebody had taken a hammer and tried to hammer your hand. So this idea that we can expand our brains, not only through the mental webs we create and the interactions, but the fact that our brain can actually incorporate external aspects of the world and bring it to be part of ourselves. So if we look at these two parts of our brain, two aspects of our brain, we start realizing that technology has an interesting impact on ourselves, and we have to be very cognizant of it. And what I started coming up with was what I call 5 extensions. And I still think I'm only scratching the surface. And I'm not going to this idea of the singularity. I'm bringing towards this idea of 1 or 2, 3 years out. I mean, what we do in our innovation lab and what we do with technology is constantly looking at things which exist today and understanding how it's going to impact technology, design, and engagement. So these 5 extensions are just the start. So the first extension is this idea of awareness. So you've got this old, evolved brain with software which made sense on the plains of Africa 50,000 years ago, but don't make so much sense today. Our fascination with fat and sugar made sense when food was scarce, but now it leads to obesity. So this idea that we can use technology to make us aware of these desires of our brains is the first step. It's what I call this awareness. We design motivational systems, and not only do we make people aware of the things which your brain's kind of emotionally drawn towards, but we try to guide them through the motivational system to things which are actually good for them. So the next one is our social minds. So one thing you'll realize is the fact that we're awash in social information. You know, you sit down on a plane, the guy next to you sits down, he folds his arms in a certain way, crosses his legs, and he harumphs, and you know he's annoyed. You probably also know he's British because Americans don't harumph. But there's a lot of social information which we're reading about people constantly. I don't know if you have this experience, but I always find when I go to a mall, when I come out of it, I feel very tired, emotionally tired, even stressed. Malls are actually designed to create a disorienting impact on your brains. But the interesting thing is being surrounded by lots of people, social information, large open spaces is actually something our brains is designed for, but not in this extent. So the crowds, we were evolved for tribes of 150 people where we knew everyone. Being surrounded by strangers in cities is something which is actually fairly stressful. I always believe that Bose should come up with a social noise canceling system along with their headphones. This idea that we constantly are awash with this social information is something which our emotional brains are actually mostly in charge of. We're not even aware of it half the time. To think about a sociopath is to understand that a sociopath doesn't have as many of the social cues and information which we have. To them, this social crowd is actually very quiet to them. To most of us, it's very loud. There's a lot of information we're reading about people, their interactions, their moods. So one of the things which we do is this idea we can use technology to translate some of that information. There's some research out of MIT by a researcher called Sandy Pentland, who has come up with something called a sociometer. The sociometer basically reads social cues. And they've done a lot of different experiments. One of the experiments I like is they did this pitch, VC pitches. So entrepreneurs pitched their business plan to a group of VCs. The VCs listened and picked the entrepreneur they liked the best. At the same time, a sociometer was reading the same information of the pitches. It doesn't have any of the contextual information. It doesn't understand language. All it's picking up is auditory, face-to-face interaction, movement, things like that, all these social cues. And it came up and picked the same entrepreneurs, the VCs. They actually did a control experiment where they had a group of VCs who didn't see the pitches, but just got the business plan and the presentations. And they actually ended up picking a totally different entrepreneur and business plan. We are reading social information, and now we've started having technology which can read and help us read that information as well. This, to me, is translating the social world for us. So I call this translation. The next one is augmentation. Anybody who's been reading science fiction for a long time or watched movies, this idea of augmenting our brains, our memory capacity is poor, or so we say. And the ability to actually augment it is something which is highly desirable. Gordon Bell out of MIT research has been doing an interesting experiment for the last few years. He's got something called a SenseCam, which they built for him, which captures auditory and visual information of every conversation and interaction he has. He's also gone on a digital-only diet. Everything he reads, every website he goes to, every movie, music, phone conversation is recorded. And it's put together into this database of which he can then search into. So he can search into any aspect of his life for the last 10 years. And the ability to augment our memories and our brains through technology is starting to become real. So the last few is the aspect of brain plasticity. So if we think about brain plasticity, there's two things which we have to realize. Our brains, our ability to adapt and change is something which is fairly new. In the last decade of research, we've understood a lot more about our plastic brains. And the ability of our brains to adapt is based on something called the myeliniation of our brain. What we thought was the white matter, which was just insulation, is actually very important to understanding how our brains learn about things and can adapt. So as we started understanding more about this 10,000-hour rule, an expert is defined as somebody who spent about 10 years or 10,000 hours of deliberate practice in a particular activity has molded their brain and changed their brain in a certain way. So the last two patterns which I talk about is simulation. I mean, this idea of the matrix where you plug in and you can train yourself to be a martial artist based on understanding and thinking through the moves is something that brain games are starting to tap into. The more you play some of these games, the more you can improve certain parts of that part of your brain. The other part of it is actually some new research which came out of Bern and Michigan, where they actually started doing brain training game called the N Dual Back. And he basically gave you two streams of information which allowed you to train your brain and increase fluid intelligence. So most brain games up to this point only allowed you to get better at that particular game. This game allowed you to actually perform better at general intelligence tasks. And this is called fluid intelligence, and it's supposed to be working on our working memory. So this idea of training and simulation and awareness and augmentation are all aspects, as I think about technology and software, being able to add that next layer of our brain, Mind 4.0. So as I think about a lot of this stuff, one of the things I always kind of keep in mind is this idea of what I started calling humane technology. This idea that as we design technology, we have to keep in mind our humanity and the ethical nature of this. One example I'll give you is this idea through the internet, we've actually started bringing back that world of our tribal communities of 150 people. Like we live with many strangers, and now through technology, we can start understanding and tracking people's reputation, it can build trust, and we can start actually understanding and connecting with people based on how our brain actually works. They used to say the old New Yorker cartoon was, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Well, today, the reality is not only do we know you're a dog, we know the hydrants you checked in at and all the people you sniffed and the email you read, right? There's a lot of information about people. So as we design these technologies, as we think about Mind 4.0, expanding our minds through software and technology, let's keep in mind that humanity and humane technology is the answer. Thank you.